When it comes to rhythm games, there's a large variety of different games available to try. Games that you play on a computer, a game console, or an arcade cabinet, often each with their own unique control schemes or gameplay gimmicks. The rhythm game genre sports some of gaming's most unique concepts, and it's a lot of fun to jump between different games and try new ones as they come out. But that uniqueness can be both a blessing and a curse. Where there's a unique gameplay mechanism, there's also a $200 controller waiting to be purchased, or a new gameplay system to learn. Where there's a hot new arcade game, there's a 2-hour drive to get to it. Rhythm games, especially those released in arcades, can be one of the most inaccessible gaming genres out there. It can be frustrating to make your way out to an arcade to try out a new rhythm game, only to realize the only way to play it again is to make that same trip out there. Especially when that trip can be hours of travel both ways. Trust me, I know. So, with that in mind, I wanted to take a look and see what the most accessible arcade rhythm games were. Arcade rhythm games can be an intimidating thing to get into, especially since time, money, and effort can all be barriers to entry in trying a game out. So I decided to come up with a 15-point scale to determine a way for me to rank what arcade rhythm games are the most accessible to play for NA players. The accessibility scale I came up with here largely centers around how easy it is to play the game at home, though there are some other factors as well. The scale is divided into 3 categories of 5 points each. I felt that the main factors determining whether a game was accessible were mainly the complexity of control input the game uses, as this creates a skill barrier entry and a learning curve, whether that game has an input device or control scheme that can be easily accessed at home, and whether the game itself is available at home, or if you would need to rely on a sim instead. I'll quickly walk through the different points on the scale so you can understand how I'm going to be scoring each game here. In the accessibility category, the one about the complexity of the game's control scheme or gameplay gimmick, I wanted to make a scale to determine how easy a game is to figure out how to play. In my mind, a touch interface is always going to be the most intuitive, especially to casual players, as most people in NA have smartphones and understand how touchscreens work. As such, in this scale, a direct touch input is considered the most accessible. Any game where you directly touch the input point when the notes hit it gets a 5 in accessibility, and any game with touch controls in relation to gameplay, even if not direct, gets a 4. 3 out of 5 is a standard buttons-only input with no additional gimmicks. 2 out of 5 is any game with a single non-standard control input somewhere in addition to regular buttons. And a 1 out of 5 is an entirely non-standard input device that you wouldn't really see anything even close to anywhere else. In the input device category, I covered how easily a game's input device is replicated or acquired. A 5 out of 5 in this category are games that can be played with a keyboard, mouse, or controller. These are things most people who play video games have around, and probably won't serve as an extra cost or barrier to entry. A 4 out of 5 would be a game that you might be able to find a controller for sitting around in a closet or at a thrift store or something. Something that you might be able to find not from a specialty store. A 3 out of 5 in input device would be that there are custom controllers out there available to purchase so that you can play the game. It might not be cheap, but there's a store that stocks them out there somewhere. Maybe even 2 or 3. A 2 out of 5 is where it gets pretty dire. I'd put games that require controllers from a seller that only takes private orders in this section. I also put VR here, as VR, while pretty widely available these days in NA, is a very large cost and space barrier, much larger than a single controller. And lastly, a 1 out of 5 for input device would be a game that requires you to DIY your own controller. Something that no one makes controllers for, and there's nowhere to buy them. That's assuming you can even play the game you're trying to make the controller for, too. Finally, the last score is availability. This is to score how easily a game can be accessed. Official game available at home? 5 out of 5. If there's a sim for the game easily available, then that's a 4 out of 5. Below here it gets a little dicey. If the game has a sim that maybe isn't as easily accessible or good, or there's a similar game that you can play that has adjacent gameplay, I'd give that a 3 out of 5. 2 would be that the game is available in NA at conventions or private arcades, and a 1 would be that the game cannot be played outside of official stores. 0.5 scores in a category indicate that the game has some aspect of a score above the whole number it received. So if you see a 0.5 rating, I'll probably explain it. Keep in mind this was a rating scale that I came up with, and it might work better on some games than others. Definitely not a definitive rating system. So with the rating scale laid out, let's talk about some of the games on the list. I'm going to start with the top 3, so let's see what the most accessible arcade rhythm games are. The first game on our list is an all-time classic, Dance Dance Revolution. You might not think a game like DDR would be very accessible, but due to the series' history and previous popularity, it's actually pretty easy to get into these days. There's currently a new home version of DDR available on PC in the form of DDR Grand Prix. It can be a little hard to get since you have to navigate a website that's in Japanese to pay for it, but it is an official at-home supported version of DDR for PC. There's also always the option of old home releases like DDR Extreme 2 or the Wii releases. As such, DDR was actually able to score a 4 out of 5 on input device since there are many options for getting a pad these days. If you want to keep it really cheap, you can still go find a soft pad somewhere and use it on your console of choice, or simply buy a converter online to use it for PC. Alternatively, if you want to take the game a bit more seriously, you can buy something like an LTEC pad, which are made new. While being a lot more expensive than a DDR soft pad, LTEC are a good entry-level pad for anyone interested in taking 4-panel more seriously. Lots of people these days even build their own pads for a similar cost to something like an LTEC, thanks to the availability of FSR sensors making pads of all shapes and sizes possible. The accessibility score is the lowest category for DDR, just having arrows for the player to step on. While this does present an immediate issue of hand-eye coordination for newer players, I think the simplicity and easy-to-understand gameplay make it an appealing entry point for players newer to rhythm games. Also, due to the game being popular in America in the past, the game is still quite recognizable for a lot of casual fans of the genre. As such, DDR remains one of the most accessible rhythm games available even over 20 years after the series started, and is a great game for any rhythm game player to check out. The next game on the list of accessible rhythm games is one that just recently earned its score for availability, Final Fantasy Theatrhythm. This one is a little odd since the series has had a lot of entries on home systems, but the 3DS entries specifically I wouldn't actually count for the availability score, because they have different gameplay and charts from the arcade version of Theatrhythm. However, with the release of Theatrhythm Final Bar Line, almost all the charts for arcade have made it to a home version, thus giving the game a 5 for availability. The game also scores a 5 on the input device scale, as the game can be simply played on a normal controller that has 2 sticks. I found the game's 2-button, 2-stick input system from the arcade translated most well to 2 shoulder buttons and 2 even sticks, but the game plays just fine on any controller. This does mean that the game lands a 3 out of 5 on accessibility for its control scheme, and the actual gameplay gimmick can take a little getting used to, but I think with its overall ease of access for the game and controllers, as well as the massive amount of content Final Bar Line has, I think Theatrhythm is a great arcade rhythm game that you can now enjoy at home as well. And finally, last but not least, the most accessible rhythm game on this scale is none other than Project Diva. Similarly to Theatrhythm, Project Diva's origins are in a game that was completely divorced from the later released arcade version, but has converged back together in the same way. Both Project Diva Future Tone on PS4 and Project Diva Megamix on Switch and PC have changed the home versions of the series entirely over to ports of arcade content, and as such, almost all content from the arcade versions of Project Diva can be enjoyed at home on a controller. The game is easily available on multiple platforms, scoring it a 5 out of 5. Input device also lands it at a 5, as even though the arcade game is played on a 4-button horizontal layout with a touch strip, the game is easily played on any modern controller that has a touch area or sticks. Custom controllers are also available for Project Diva from a few different sellers if you're interested in making the home experience more arcade accurate as well. The only area where Project Diva doesn't get a 5 out of 5 is in accessibility. It is a button-based game, so you will have to get used to the hand-eye coordination of the positioning of the buttons and layouts of holds on the controller. That said, I gave it a half point in this category specifically for the Switch version, which has a touch-based mode that allows you to turn the bottom of the screen into an arcade-style layout. This allows you to not only have a touch input for the game, but also a more arcade-accurate one, allowing Switch users to play the arcade charts on the controller layout that they were designed for. A super great feature that makes the game just a smidge more intuitive to play. So on our scale here, those are the top 3 most accessible arcade rhythm games, but let's quickly touch on some other observations I had while making this scale. First off, when comparing Konami and Sega's rhythm games, Konami has taken massive steps in the accessibility department in the last few years with their PC home releases, known as Konaste, or Konami Amusement Game Station. While most of them require subscriptions and have high-cost song packs, they do allow users to play at home, and most unofficial home controllers can be made to work with them, allowing for most of Konami's arcade games to be played at home officially. Sega, by comparison, has some of the lowest scoring games on this list, not due in part to the fact that their games would be difficult to port to a home market without some sort of custom controllers or other modifications to gameplay. Some games also don't score well on this scale intuitively. I prioritized touchscreen and button inputs as the most intuitive, so on this scale Taiko scores a 1 in accessibility despite being popular with casual players, due entirely to its non-standard no-buttons controls. Games like Waka and U-Beat score well on the accessibility scale, but fail in other areas due to lack of home availability of sims and controllers. And some games like Dance Rush and Museka score horrendously low, essentially being able to only be played at arcades and conventions due to their entirely non-standard control schemes and complete lack of availability of controllers and sims. But I know what you're all wondering. What's the least accessible rhythm game? As of right now, the least accessible rhythm game is a tie between Music Diver and Chrono Circle. Lending mostly to the newness of the games, though the control schemes don't help, these games both scored the minimum possible score on this scale, a 3 out of 15. Neither game is available outside of official arcades in any capacity, both games have an entirely non-standard input method making them not friendly to casual players, and neither have any sims or controllers available for them, making home play impossible. Maybe one day I'll tell you guys about my conspiracy theory for circular-shaped arcade rhythm games. So those are some of the most and least accessible arcade rhythm games. The genre is pretty all over in terms of accessibility, whether due to expensive controllers, hard-to-find games, or confusing gameplay concepts, but overall there are definitely some arcade rhythm game experiences you can have at home, and that accessibility is getting better with people making more sims and controllers every day. Make sure to keep an eye out for new home releases of arcade games, and for your favorite controller manufacturer to release new controllers, so you can finally play that game you've been waiting for at home. Thanks for watching, and thanks so much to my supporters on Patreon. Check out my Twitter, Twitch, and community Discord. Links are in the description below. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.